Today we're going to look at a book about Tintagel Castle on the rugged, beautiful coast of Cornwall. There'll be lots of book and page turning sounds, stories and history that will put you to sleep. So make yourself comfortable and let's look at this book together. You can see the castle ruins on the ridge of this piece of land that juts out off the Cornish coast, and the caves in the cliffside. This is a red seal. You can see the king sitting there. And this is a map of the historic site, which now belongs to English heritage. The castle ruins are here and here. The land has fallen down and eroded so that a bridge had to be built between the old town abbey that's still in ruins and the feasting hall, and all around this little promontory are ruins of the outbuildings that serviced this castle. And here we have again the seal, Semper Augustus, and that will be Ricardus. It's Richard. And there we have a beautiful photograph of the sunset setting west of the coast of Cornwall into the sea, built half on the mainland and half on a jagged headland projecting into the Cornish Sea. Tintagel Castle is one of the most spectacular historic sites in Britain. Its association with King Arthur makes it also one of the most famous, but the history of the site stretches back centuries before the first tales of Arthur. During the so-called Dark Ages, roughly the 5th to the 7th centuries, Tintagel was an important stronghold. Large quantities of pottery fragments, remains of luxury goods imported from the Mediterranean, were left behind by those who lived here in its highly defensible position. It is likely to have been a residence of a Dark Age ruler of Cornwall. Tintagel emerges again in the 12th century, but as as legend, not history, as a seat of Cornish kings in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written around 1138, and in continental poems telling the story of Tristan and Isolde. The remains that are visible today belong to a castle built 100 years later on the orders of the hugely rich and ambitious Richard, Earl of Cornwall, who lived from 1209 to 1272. The site was of no strategic value. Legend alone seems to have inspired Richard to build in this place. Although the castle had fallen into disrepair by the 1330s, its mythical associations meant that it remained a source of interest. Tourists were arriving by the end of the 17th century, and during the 19th century, the explosion of interest in Arthurian legend and the expansion of the railway brought vast numbers to the site. In the 1930s, the archaeologist Raleigh Radford uncovered remains on the island of what he thought was an early Christian monastery. Archaeological discoveries since have suggested otherwise, but in many ways Tintagel's early history remains mysterious. Together with its spectacular landscape, its mystery has helped to foster the site's special significance as a place of legend long associated with King Arthur. And here we see an aerial view. You can see the foundations of ruins there, the bridges and pathways. And a very nice little drawing of what it might have looked like, this doorway to the castle. And here we have Richard, the Duke of Cornwall, and all of the people coming to greet him, and someone taking his horse, the standard above the portico. So I'm thinking it's his cousin Richard Lionheart, perhaps. Whom he's trying to emulate. And we have a view here. The mainland courtyards. And that's Tintagel Parish Church and the ruins here. Another aerial view, the mainland and the footbridge and the castle remains. And the different stages. These caves might be smugglers' caves, but in legend they're known as Merlin's Cave. We'll read more about that. Here we have what the site will have been around 1260. The port gateways and the mead hall led to this wall falling down, as well as bits here. In 1390, even more has fallen into the sea, and in 1540 we don't have much of a change. During the 5th and 6th centuries, an isthmus would have enabled passage directly from the far northwestern end of the lower courtyard to the island. This isthmus survived into the 12th century, as recorded by the scholar Geoffrey of Monmouth in his History of the Kings of Britain, who writes that the only entrance to the island's stronghold in the sea and shut in on all sides by it was by a narrow rock that 3 armed soldiers would be able to defend, even if you had the whole kingdom of Britain at your side. The narrow approach to the island possibly gave the stronghold its name from the Cornish din or tin, meaning a fortress or natural stronghold resembling a fortress, and tagel, meaning a constriction. Tintagel, the fortress of the narrow entrance. By the 1230s, when Richard built his castle, the isthmus had already partly eroded on the side of the cliff. Beside the steps, rubbish deposits dating from before the building of the castle have been exposed by later landfalls. Here we see the courtyard on the island. So coming from the mainland, and there are the buildings, and then either side of the entrance, the courtyard. And there we see what was built after 1852. So the orange parts are the oldest, and the 14th century saw the green. Richard would have built all of the orange and yellow parts. And here's a beautiful, beautiful old map. John Norden's depiction of Tintagel about 1604, showing the treacherous passage to the island and sheep grazing among the castle buildings. See the little sheep, and having to climb down and up to get up to that castle. Must have been a very quiet and lonely place. And truly, like Brittany, its coastline is replete with mystery. This is the Iron Gate. There's a cave and the gate there. On leaving the Great Hall path, immediately to the right leads down towards a cleft in the rocks. Sometimes it erodes up under, and there are holes where the sea can be heard. This forms a small cove that faces northeast and is sheltered from the prevailing westerly winds. The path stops at the cove at an archway in a curtain wall, which was once closed off by a gate. From here, defenders could prevent access to the land via the cove and the larger haven to the south. John Leyland, visiting the site in 1540, writes that men all saw therein a postern door of iron, hence the Iron Gate. There is now no access to the cove beyond the curtain wall, which runs from the edge of the cliff overlooking the cove to a point about 30 meters to the southwest, where the slope becomes precipitous. And truly, if you are not careful, you can tumble down into the sea. In 1583, at the time of the threat of invasion from Spain, before the Armada of 1588, the naval commander, Sir Richard Grenville, 1542 to 1591, recorded the use of the Iron Gate as a landing place, noting that 4 or 5 ships could, with most winds, ride and lay their sides to the works and land any company of men. Here are some older remains. This is a glass fragment found in the lower mainland courtyard that came from a bowl decorated with an inscription. Looks to be in Latin with some birds. And here we have the island remains looking south towards the island courtyard. And these ruins here on either side. There's the courtyard there. These ones are from hundreds of 1,000 years earlier than the rest of the castle. There we can see this is what the island would have looked like about 700. And that's these stone remains there. So it looks to have been always part of a stone fortress and a nice little cove for ships. The Artognu slate found on the eastern slopes of Tintagel Island had been trimmed to fit over a 5th to 7th century drain near the main buildings. Discovered in 1998, it had 2 surviving sets of partial inscriptions. The first consists of 4 large letters and dates from before the second text. The second includes lightly inscribed letters that denote male personal names and is thought to date from the 6th century. All the lettering is in the nature of casual graffiti. And they look to be Celtic names. The interesting thing about this is that it mentions Artognu. The name Artognu is Celtic and can be translated as bear, famous, or famous in a bear-like way. Paterni Goliawi ficit Artognu Goliawi. The image of the bear was used in early poetry to represent heroic valor. Art, later Arth, was a common element in personal names. The similarity to Arthur is, however, only partial, and was shared by many other names. Goliawi and Paterni are forms of name denoting relationship, but with only a fragment remaining, the type of relationship remains unclear. Ficit and singular. Here we have this mysterious tunnel. The origins of the tunnel are unknown. It may be an extension of a natural fissure, enlarged by chiseling the rock. There are marks made by narrow chisel that can be seen on the walls. One idea is that it served as a long and narrow larder for the castle in the Middle Ages, and may have had a door set in a wooden frame at the end near the sea to aid cooling and food preservation. And this is a kiln in the corner of one of the houses of the northern ruins. It was probably used for drying corn in the Middle Ages, when the Dark Ages buildings may have constituted a farmstead. Courtenay Arthur Raleigh Radford was born in 1900. After graduating from Oxford, he helped excavate Whitby Abbey. Under Charles Pearce, the chief inspector of ancient monuments, he then spent several years studying and traveling abroad, and in 1933 began excavations at Tintagel at the request of the Ministry of Works. And in 1935, the first edition of his guide to the site was published. It's another beautiful view of this cove of mystery. And here, a granite stone found in the remains of the island chapel and thought to date from the 12th to 13th century. It is now built into the side altar of the north transept of Tintagel Parish Church. And there are the remains of the chapel of St. Juliot, with the Camelot Castle Hotel on the mainland, visible in the distance. In descending to the haven at the front of the valley, the remains of the platforms and derricks via which slate was loaded onto the ships waiting in the harbour below can be seen. There they are loading slate onto ships. It's a very romantic view of Tintagel with the rainbow going over it. The haven was long regarded as an excellent place to land. On the west side of the haven beach is the entrance to a cavern that passes right through the neck of the island. It shows signs of having been widened as a consequence of mining work, but it had also been eroded by the water that runs through it at high tide. Since the late 19th century, it has been named Merlin's Cave. And there we see a depiction here. Merlin stands on the shore of Tintagel as the sea delivers him the future King Arthur. And this is a French edition of The Idylls of the King by Alfred Lord Tennyson, illustrated by Gustave Doré. Merlin's Cave is probably so called because of the popular popularity of Tennyson's sequence of 12 poems, Idylls of the King, published between 1859 and 1885, in which Merlin plucks the infant Arthur from the sea. When Uther in Tintagel passed away, moaning and wailing for an heir, the two, Merlin and Blake, dropped to the cave and watched the great sea fall, wave after wave, each mightier than the last, till last a ninth one, gathering half the deep and full of voices, slowly rose and plunged roaring, and all the wave was in a flame, and down the wave and in the flame was born a naked babe, and rode to Merlin's feet, who stooped and caught the babe and cried, "The king, here is an heir for Uther." And here we have a manuscript of Tristan and Iseult. Here King Mark discovers Tristan and Iseult embracing inside Tintagel Castle, and Tristan then leaves Tintagel in disgrace. And there they are embracing, and the King Mark is there, and there's Tristan. Here we can see that this is a French manuscript, but late. It is a 15th century manuscript. It's a beautiful gold leaf. Look at that. And lines very clearly written. And we have the history from pre-Roman times. The coastline of this part of Cornwall is fretted with picturesque beaches and narrow bays that resound to crashing waves. Heavily defended headland settlements of this type are found in the Iron Age period, roughly 7th century BC to the 1st century AD. Evidence for a Roman presence near Tintagel is slight, and comes late in the Roman occupation of Britain, about AD 43 to 410. A Roman milestone from the 3rd century was found in Tintagel courtyard. There we can see it. Tintagel seems to have been very active in trade, with the Mediterranean being on the Cornish coast. Here we have a purse of Roman coins, or one coin from this Roman purse of coins that was found near the Great Ditch. This one was minted under Emperor Tetricus I, who reigned from 270 to 273. And here we can see I think it's a mosaic of a Roman trade ship loaded with goods. This exists in the Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily and dates to the 3rd century. And there we can see pottery finds at Tintagel and a Roman amphora. This amphora would have carried wine or oil. This kind of pottery, as well as glass, were imported from all over the Mediterranean. Mediterranean during the Dark Ages. The known sources of the wares are shown here. North African red slipware, wine jars, just in Turkey's southeast and west coast and all through the Aegean. Glassware from Gascony, what would become Gascony, and the south of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, all on the sea route to Tintagel. Several thousand pieces of pottery have been found at Tintagel. Some are local Romano-British, and some are medieval and date from the time of the castle, but most date from the Dark Ages, and nearly all of the latter were imported from the Mediterranean. Here we have these stories of King Arthur. Is King Arthur battling some cat-like monster known as the Chapalu, depicted on a floor mosaic at Otranto Cathedral in Italy, dating from between 1163 and 1166. And here is one of Arthur fighting on St. Michael's Mount from an early 15th century copy of Geoffrey of Monmouth. The foremost figure, popularly linked with Tintagel, is King Arthur. There is minimal historical evidence for Arthur, and nothing to associate him with Tintagel until the 12th century. The earliest surviving mention of his name is in the Historia Britonum, a manuscript assembled from a mixture of historical sources and folk tales in North Wales, about 829 to 830, attributed in one text to a scholar called Nennius. Arthur was probably included in the Historia Britonum to please Merlin, King of Gwynedd in North Wales. And I don't know if my Welsh pronunciation is correct, so if you are Welsh, please be kind in the comments. I'm sorry if I mispronounce the Welsh. The first of a new dynasty of kings, Merlin may have wanted to associate himself with a war hero believed to have repeatedly defeated the forebears of the English kings who had harassed Wales in the early 9th century. Arthur's enormous international popularity was largely owing to one author, a scholar called Geoffrey of Monmouth. It was he who first linked Arthur with Tintagel, describing it as the island fortress where Arthur was conceived, thanks to the magic of Merlin. In about 1138, Geoffrey drastically embellished previous accounts of Arthur in his Historia Regnum Britanniae. By this time, stories of Arthur and his warriors were already known on the continent. Geoffrey described Arthur as a youth of unparalleled courage and generosity, joined with that sweetness of temper and innate goodness, as granted him universal love and turned him as an adult from a victorious battle leader into the greatest of a line of kings of Britain and conqueror of most of Western and Northern Europe, whose renown had attracted the bravest knights of the continent to his court. Geoffrey also included elements of legend that depicted Arthur defeating a giant on St. Michael's Mount. Despite these more obvious fantasies, Geoffrey placed Arthur in an apparently historical 6th century Britain, expressed in detail relevant to his 12th century audience, and so provided the court of the Norman kings of England with a credible, heroic role model. And this is a round table that was made about 1290, and you can see King Edward III on it. He was a big fan of King Arthur and Arthurian legend. There were the names of all of the knights. This is the earliest known Arthurian round table, but made in 1290. The painting on the surface of the tabletop is actually 16th century. It now hangs in the Great Hall of Winchester Castle. So from Geoffrey of Monmouth's time, that was the time of Henry II, Arthur, the stories of King Arthur had become a hugely popular phenomenon all over the whole of Europe. And here we have another story related to Tintagel and Arthurian legend. King Mark of Cornwall, or the story of Tristan and Isolde, or in German Tristan und Isolde. Also surviving in many versions, English, French, and German being the most popular. It should be remembered that Tintagel is hardly mentioned in Arthurian romance except in the work of Geoffrey and his followers. An educated European in about 1200 would sooner have associated the name Tintagel with the legendary figures of Mark and Tristan. King Mark of Cornwall first appears as a local king in legends from Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. In his 9th century life of St. Paul Aurelian, a Breton monarch identifies Mark with a king, Cunimorus, who ruled in Cornwall in the 6th century. A standing stone near Fowey claims to mark the grave of Tristanus, son of Cunimorus. It has been suggested that Tristanus is Tristan, son of Mark. Raleigh Radford thought that Castle Torre, a small Iron Age fort near Fowey, had been Cunimorus' fortress, but the fort is now known to have had no significant Dark Age occupation. The connection of the name Tristan with Tintagel arose in the 12th century, when the earliest surviving accounts of the story of Tristan and Isolde, continental poems from France and Germany, were first composed. In these, Tintagel appears as the location of King Mark's court. Tristan is not his son, but his nephew, who becomes the lover of Mark's wife Isolde. Though originally part of a separate story, by the end of the 12th century, Mark, Tristan, and Isolde had been drawn firmly into the ambit of Arthur, Mark as a contemporary minor king, and Tristan as knight of the Round Table. as I said before, but I do make mistakes. Sorry about that. Richard, Earl of Cornwall, and his lion. Look at that. This is a floor tile from an abbey in Somerset, dating from the end of the 13th century, and that's Richard of Cornwall's coat of arms. And this is what his Tintagel Castle would have looked like. And here we see everything that belonged to Richard, Earl of Cornwall. The construction of a castle at Tintagel would have done little to dent the wealth of one of the richest men in Europe, while many of Richard's surviving charters concern the boroughs of Cornwall, which was one of the major sources of his revenues. Profiting as he did from the export of Cornish tin, he rarely visited the country. Arthur and his knights would have been the principal role models for boys in royal and noble households, including Richard. Richard was the second son of King John and younger brother of Henry III, making Richard Lionheart his Uncle Dickie. Richard had huge estates in England and used this wealth to pursue a European throne. But though he was crowned King of the Romans on 17th of May 1257, and that's the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, therefore he was nominally the king of modern-day Germany, or emperor of all of the German kingdoms, but he never managed to translate this title into real power there. He was made Earl of Cornwall by Henry in 1227, making him the most powerful man in the county. Later, Tintagel had become a prison. Despite the castle's increasingly ruinous condition, Mass was still said in the chapel on the island, and a survey of the properties made in 1337 for the Black Prince, the son of Edward III, who became that year the first Duke of Cornwall, described 2 decayed chambers over 2 gateways, one sufficient chamber with a kitchen for the constable, a decayed stable for 8 horses, a cellar, and a ruined bakehouse. And here we have Edward III granting his son, Edward the Black Prince, the Principality of Aquitaine. And here, by 1583, we can see that the castle is falling to ruins. And here is a very handsome portrait of Sir Richard Grenville in 1571, who died of wounds fighting at sea in 1591. Tennyson, who celebrated Arthur in Idylls of the King, also celebrated Grenville in his poem called The Revenge, after his ship. And here we have Life Goes On at Tintagel. Slate and a ship at the cove, possibly smugglers using the caves, and archaeology and the revival of the Gothic, as well as pre-Raphaelite inspiration. is made at Tintagel for MGM Studios. Ava Gardner was Guinevere, Mel Ferrer as King Arthur, Robert Taylor as Sir Lancelot. The movie was called Knights of the Round Table. And there we have a bit of geological markings to show the cliffs and crags and the remains of all the buildings at Tintagel, this wonderful Cornish site. I hope you're beautifully relaxed now. I wish you sweet dreams and a very restful, pleasant sleep. Be good to yourself